aimed to, there we go. And I was just on a roll there. So Operation Resilience is really aimed at veteran suicide in terms of reuniting veterans with independence. So the program so far has hosted over, well, close to 500 combat veterans who have been tested service members through retreats held in Texas, North Carolina, and California. And the goal is that to ensure that the unit that experiences battle together experiences healing together as well. I love that. So we had a conversation yesterday about the various groups within Weddington that were going to be joining us today, from clergy, from Stephen's minister, from the military mission. And Dr. Franklin shared that the Columbia method was originally intended for military, but it's now being expanded into other areas like us, like faith-based organizations. So as you can see, we're going to be recording today. The chat is open if you have questions, or you can certainly speak directly to Dr. Franklin. So Dr. Franklin, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm happy to be with you guys today and thrilled that you have an interest in this topic. I'm a social worker by trade. I have a master's in social work. My PhD is also in social work. My area over the years has really zeroed in on military trauma. Part of that probably also comes from a personal level. I was raised on military bases. My dad was an enlisted sailor. And my husband's also in the Air Force. He's still at the Pentagon now. Yeah, so I also raised two small children moving around quite a bit before we settled down in Northern Virginia. And I had a full career in government. I did lead behavioral health for the Marine Corps, all during the buildup of the war effort from 2008 to 2015. So very familiar with just the troop issues on the ground there. And really zoned in on studying military trauma and how military trauma impacts families was really my interest. And then I landed at the Pentagon leading suicide prevention, like Nish said, and then over at the VA. And so I've really learned a lot. So after leaving federal service and now I'm in private sector, I'm collaborating with Columbia University. I actually collaborated with them when I was in the working with the military. The university came down and helped train our Marines, particularly our attorneys at the time. We had found in some data on suicide risk that our attorneys were a key and essential touch point for suicide risk because the Marines were there was a certain number of the Marines that were in legal trouble in the days leading up to their death by suicide. And so we began to think at the time, well, what would it look like if we brought the attorneys on board into our solution set so they could at least screen for suicide? Granted, this was a long time ago, but that was when I met Dr. Kelly Posner, who's the creator of this scale that I'm about to tell you more about. It's really a simple 6-question scale that assesses for suicide risk. So I'll sort of talk to you about some of the risk factor suicide and what I've learned at both the DoD and the VA and even at the incredible work going on at the Independence Fund. So I'll sort of go through some of that and then I'll show you the scale and sort of how to use the scale because the big push behind the scale now is that anybody can use it. It's not just something that should be used just in hospital settings. In fact, if we're only screening for suicide risk in hospital settings, we're waiting too long and too late. So that's really a big kind of important issue in the field. So just by way of getting us started here, you can see a little bit, and I won't read the slides, but you can look at them and you'll see a little bit about like the prevalence, like how big is the problem. I am from Massachusetts originally, and this would definitely qualify as what we would call a wicked problem, like a wicked hard problem. It's very, very complex. You can see the number of individuals writ large, not just veterans, but that die by suicide and the latest data that has come out in 2002. And you see how that kind of racked and stacks against other type of problems, other type of medical issues and things like that. Know that the US has one of the highest rates when we look at other countries, and we can talk more about what we believe the rationale for some of that is. It's not easy. It's not cut and dry, but it's the second leading cause of death for veterans under the age of 45. And you see here that the rate has increased. We have a phrase in the field called men in the middle years, and it really gets after the fact that there are these men over the age of 55 that are at increased risk, particularly for veterans. We're worried about folks that feel, particularly men, but across the board, that they no longer have a sense of belonging. What is my mission? What is my purpose in life? If I'm no longer wearing the military uniform, what does that mean for me as a man at 55? Like, what have been my contributions so far, and what does that mean for me going forward? Ironically, and I see the data set points not on here, but when we look at females, it's women that are in the throes of parenting. When we do have higher rates of female veterans for suicide compared to their non-veteran counterparts, but for women, it's when they are in the throes of life and parenting. So it's a younger age. It's like 35 to 45, where the demographic age sort of gets higher for those that end their life by suicide. So know that that it impacts everybody. Like, people should not begin to think that, this is an enlisted issue, or this is a veteran issue, or it's an officer issue. No, like, it can impact anybody. Second leading cause of death in our nation for 18 to 24-year-olds. And so we think about, like, who's at risk? Who do we know? Like, what do we know about them that's potentially at risk? And some of it are things that we cannot change, you and I. Right? If somebody has a history of abuse, that makes them at higher risk, whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse. If they're struggling with substance abuse issues, it's like, there are certain things that, like, it would be good to know about, but, like, in some cases, not always something you can do about it. And then there's a set of things that there is something you can do about it. And I want to make sure I tell you about mental health. So we in the field, there's long been this sort of standing issue in the field where people thought that if somebody died by suicide, they definitely had a known mental health problem. Like, clearly, you'll even hear people that aren't so close to the fields like, oh, that person's crazy, or that person obviously has mental health issues. Know that about half of those that die by suicide do not have a mental health problem. They have, like, what I call, like, life problems. They're struggling with, like, financial struggles, um, struggles that probably the church knows well, right? Like, they're struggling with social, like, isolation. They're struggling with relationship issues, housing, transitional issues. It's not always a mental health problem. So I just want to make sure you know that. The one thing that I saw, like, I led the National Fatality Review Board here in DC, and we looked at every suicide, and we would look at, like, the days leading up to a death by suicide. Where did that military service member or veteran, where did they go? Who did they talk to? Did they go to work? Did they have a medical appointment? We would pull the thread on everything we could leading up to a death by suicide. And the one thing, if someone asked me, and I got this question on the Hill a lot testifying on this subject, if somebody asked me what would be the one thing I would tell you, it's social support. Like, they have a lack of social support. Like, their relationships with others have deteriorated, like burned bridges. You will ask them, who are you close with? Who's in your corner? Who do you go to at 2 in the morning if you need help? And they will say, well, I used to go to this person, but I can't anymore because of this. Or I used to do this and now I don't. And they literally feel like they're a burden and they don't have anybody in their corner. So social support did hang true a lot. As well, sleep issues across the board. And these are easy things you can ask people about. Like, this is not part of the Columbia scale per se, but it's usually pretty acceptable in the context of in the faith community or at work to say, how'd you sleep? That's probably okay. Like, even though we just met, I could maybe ask Robin, how'd you sleep? Right? Like, that's like an okay thing to ask. But know that sleep is an important issue for problem solving, for coping, for being able to be social and connect with others, for being vulnerable. Like, in the absence of sleep, people are at risk. There's this famous sort of researcher in the field, Thomas Joyner, if you want to look up his work, devoted his whole career to suicide prevention. I believe it was his dad that died by suicide, and he's just been a longstanding researcher in the field and helped me quite a bit when I worked in the Pentagon. He used to share that in the absence of screening for suicide, if you screened for sleep, it could be a proxy for suicide risk. So I always thought that was interesting because people are sometimes afraid to ask the question, are you thinking of ending your life by suicide? But they might ask, are you, particularly like a military leader, hey, you sleeping okay? They might say that. So you can see some of the risk factors here. I do have to mention the firearms piece. It's always a touchy subject with our veterans, right? Because we never want to come across like we're telling people, like, limit their firearms, right? Because that is not what we're trying to do, particularly with our veterans who love their firearms, right? But one thing we see within our veteran data is 70% of those veterans that die by suicide, they do it with a firearm. And why this is important is because their non-veteran like matched counterparts, a similar cohort group, uses firearms only 50% of the time. But why it's important about how they die by suicide is because suicide is an impulsive act. Like when there's just a very short period of time when somebody decides they're going to end their life by suicide, that they do it. And when they use a firearm, it is so impulsive and so deadly that when we're trying to prevent suicide, we're trying to like get people housing, we're trying to get them jobs, we're trying to get them involved in a faith-based community. We're trying to, spirituality is a huge protective factor for suicide risk. We're trying to do a whole lot of things all at once. And we are trying to limit their access to a firearm when they're in that moment of struggle, not forever. So there's this research that even speaks to the fact that if a firearm is in like a locked safe, and if they have to like unlock it, those few moments of unlocking it will break the cycle of suicidal thinking and potentially get them to safety. So it's just one of like 10 or 12 strategies. Where mental health people get caught up is they'll talk about it in a way that says, and we used to even have like a policy in the Pentagon called restricting access to lethal means or limiting access to lethal means. And it's really not about restricting people's access. This is about just putting some space between someone at risk and any mean. That could be pills, that could be a bridge. Like, we don't want someone at risk to be hanging out on the Golden Gate Bridge, right? We just don't. Like, we want them in a safe house with the door closed with someone who they cares about them. We don't want someone at risk with, a gallon Ziploc bag full of deadly meds either. So we just talk a lot about firearms because that's the main item that veterans use. And we talk about it in a way sometimes not carefully. And it does need to be talked about super carefully because we'll turn our veterans away. We'll lose them. Um, the other big one I want to tell you about when it comes to suicide that we don't talk about a lot, which I think is a simple one, is employment. So, of course, our veterans love their jobs. And is there no bigger purpose in life, right, than like defending our nation's security, right? Like they're so proud of it and it's like so important. But then when they're no longer working in those roles, like how do they ever find that same sense of mission and purpose? Like even when they do something else, sometimes maybe as a civilian or they join like the local fire department or and it's such they feel like such a part of a mission, right? Like I'm part of the fire department and they'll like I'm part of the they'll rattle off the number of the truck they work on or whatever. But employment, when our veterans have jobs, they have hopefully healthcare. It's a misnomer. All veterans don't have access to VA healthcare, right? And VA healthcare is also getting better, but it's clumsy and bumpy. It's not easy. You can't just like pick up a phone and make an appointment that quick. If only, right? When I worked at the VA, I learned there's like 14 different levels of care and Title 32 and Title this and Title that. And oh, gracious, right? Did they serve during combat? Did they do this? Did they? So it's not easy, but having like healthcare is important. Having a job is important because they have healthcare. Hopefully they're part of a mission. They feel a sense of belongingness. Hopefully, I don't know about you guys, but I have like friends at work, my most dear friends. And I have fun. I'm getting to talk to you guys today. Like this is fun. Nothing more I'd rather do on this afternoon than visit with a friend of the Independence Fund and talk about suicide prevention. Like sign me up for that, right? So it's fun. And so when we think it's just like a job, like a job, or even if it's a career, but know that it has like five other protective factors for suicide. And when our veterans are engaged in employment that they find meaningful through their lens, then we're doing good work. And you can see some of the other risk factors on this slide. Definitely, I saw alcohol in the fatality review reports. Like I would see that they were under the influence of alcohol when they took the act of death by suicide. We don't use the word committed. We try not to use the word committed. So you won't hear like people don't commit cancer. They don't commit. We try not to use that word. So we'll say death by suicide in the field. Um, and then the other thing is really just the financial issues. There's been a lot of new research on the intersection of financial struggles and suicide risk. And part of that is just the embarrassment, I think, and the shame of like having to raise your help when you're overcome by finances or you've overcommitted. So I even had here in my own community, my son played on a basketball team. Another boy on his team's dad died by suicide, and we found out through the circumstances that the dad was in had a business, and the business had some struggles, and he felt very responsible. And businesses have struggles, do they not? And like sometimes, like it's not always easy to plan for financial situations with businesses. Of course, that wasn't his only struggle. That's the other thing I should have said. Like when someone dies by suicide, there's usually like 20 factors interacting all at once. It's never like one thing, like the business went down. It's like a lot of things all at once. So that's what makes it so complicated as a field to get after. I
But
use,
Dr. Franklin, let me just add a
yes,
comment
please,
here.
please.
There are several people who joined after we started.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so you might not be
Excellent.
able to see them all without
No, I
using the
can't. You're
screen.
right. You're right. I
Yeah,
can move down though and see some new faces.
yeah. And so for all
Welcome,
of you,
everyone. Thank you for slowing me down, Nish.
you're welcome. You're welcome. And for all of you, if you have questions, feel free to just ask and interrupt like I just did.
Yep.
Or,
Or put it in the
or you
chat.
can
Yep.
put them in the chat as well. And we are recording this.
Yes. Excellent. So we were so far talking about prevalence rates, who's at risk, why are they at risk, like what are the risk factors, what happens when they're at risk. And much of this we've discussed on this slide, but I do want to bring up coping and problem solving. What we see when people are struggling with suicide risk is they're thinking very much in black and white. So think about that, a black and white sort of situation, they struggling in the gray, and then a moment of impulsivity and an inability to cope or problem solve. I'm a burden. I see no way out. You know, even when you're like, well, there are other jobs. Well, you could walk away from this company and start over. No matter what you offer, there will be a like a black and white, I can't find a way out of solving this problem sort of situation. And then despite the fact that I mentioned that many are struggling with many don't have mental health issues, about half, and half do, those that do have a mental health issue, we know that our veterans are hesitant to come into care for mental health. They're not like quick first to sign me up, right? Like it's gotten better, you know. My father's was in the Navy from 1971 onward, and he talks about his time early back then, you know, how they treated mental health to like how it's looked at now. So it's gotten a lot better, but still there is a stigma and people don't quickly go. So we have to like be mindful of that. And that's why I also appreciate the fact that the Independence Fund does these entities on weekends and outside of the hospital system, because we can capture and help people who we might not have normally been able to help. And we have some survey work that looked at like why they don't come in for care. And if any of you on the call are veterans yourselves, you might recognize some of this, but they'll say like this word like broken, which is like an awful word to use about it, right? But they're afraid of confidentiality because they're afraid like if they are working in law enforcement or if they have a security clearance, they're afraid to come forward because there's like struggles for that. Can they still carry a weapon? Can they still perform their duties? Well, people think less of them if they're receiving mental health care for depression, when they're in this important role that they serve in. So they do worry about career implications, and some of that are those are very serious, you know, worries, and we have to sort of sort through some of those things. I have like two or three different myths that I want to share. And the first one is that people who think about suicide die by suicide. And you see here that lots of people will have thoughts, and we find that out in mental health assessments. We find that out in primary care. You know, in 2021, over 12 million people thought of suicide. And so the next question we ask them, which you'll learn about on the scale that I'm about to show you, is do you have a plan? Right. And you'll see there's a scaled down number that actually have a plan. And we will ask them, have you started to enact this plan? And I'll show you that question. You know, have you made an attempt? And then it goes down and you'll see how many. So all of those are like opportunities for us to come in as fellow parishioners, practitioners, friends, neighbors, colleagues, to come in and like offer help, really. And so I just want you to know, like, if someone thinks about it, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to die by suicide. There's this misconception that says owning a firearm is not associated with suicide risk. When you own one, and furthermore, when it's not stored properly, it is a suicide risk. You know, we have a very close colleague at the Independence Fund, and she talks about how her husband, he felt like he was storing his firearm very safely because he stored it on top of the refrigerator. And they had two small children, and it was high up. And so like these two little kids could never get on top of the fridge. They were just little. But when he wasn't struggling and when he was under alcohol, it was quick and easy access and it was impulsive. It was just less than a few seconds and he was gone. He ended his life by suicide. So know that owning a firearm does increase the risk of someone dying in the home unless, it's kept in a safely stored, and you see the risk level 4 to 6 times more. And I shared with you that data point. I said it was 70%, it's 73. And I shared that the non firearms was 50, it's 52. But you see the connection here between firearms. So if you remove access to one lethal method, they'll go find another. People have said this to me for years. If you lock up their firearm, or if you as a friend, if Robin holds the firearm of Lyle for a day while he's struggling, because they've had a conversation and agreed upon that, not because she just swooped in and took it away, that person will then go find another method. They'll go find a bottle of pills, or they'll go find a bridge. Know that that's just not true. Like, we've interviewed for the field countless of attempt survivors and people that have struggled with suicide risk. When you can break that suicidal thinking and the cycle, you can get them on the pathway for help in such a solid way that they don't go searching for some other method. We just don't see that. I shared already that people think it's not impulsive. It's so impulsive. I worked at the Department of Defense when Kate Spade died by suicide. I was also in government when Anthony Bourdain died by suicide, these national figures. And when work in this field, you're like, okay, I want to study this out. I want to know what we know about it. What were the risks? Were there protective factors? What was in place? Who knew? Um, and we see they're very, very impulsive acts across the board, not just those national stage examples, but our veterans that live right in our towns and communities as well. There is this misconception that if you talk about it, you'll give them the idea. So I get to talk to a lot of parents and they're like afraid to bring up suicide risk with their teenagers because they're like, I don't want to say the S word. I'm afraid, like, if I bring it up. And in fact, the opposite, when we interview those that were asked about suicide and we say, like, how did it feel? Like, somebody brought it up to you, like, or they asked you the question, like, I felt like they cared about me. I felt like they were willing to have a hard conversation with me. So it does not give them the idea. You did not plant the seed in any way. Um, I talked already about the mental health issue. Um, this was a tricky one, and I got this question a lot on the Hill when I would go testify as well. And there's this big phenomenon that says deployment increases suicide risk. If we have veterans on the call, they may resonate with this. And trauma does. Not every deployment is traumatic, and every deployment is different, and where you deploy and how you deploy and what job you perform while you deploy and what level. There's even a scale, right, called the combat exposure scale. Like, just because you were deployed, you may not have been exposed to combat. And so it's like a peel back the onion complicated situation. Deployment alone does not increase risk for suicide. But when you're deployed and or during a deployment and you're aiming your weapon at the enemy and or, say, for example, seeing child death and being exposed to trauma like none other, that does increase your risk, particularly when it goes untreated. So you start to see how it's like a kind of a complicated situation. So in years past, I've been a social worker since 1994. When we first came into the field, um, we had a medical model to treating suicide, and it basically said, become a clinician and wait in your office between Monday and Friday from 8 to 5. And when people are at risk, they will come to you and you will help them. That was kind of the thinking. Like, and it was a hospital model, right? And I did it, right? Like, I worked at the 62nd Medical Group at McChord Air Force Base as a GS employee, and I stayed in the office from 7:30 to 4:30. When people came, I helped them. And that was like the medical model. And it's very, like, years later, we've now determined that it's a narrow approach because many of them never make it to the hospital. And it puts all the burden on the mental health team. Many don't have a mental health diagnosis, and you just miss all these people. Like, and now, fast forward many years, we now consider suicide a public health issue. And that says you have to have a broad approach. You have to target the whole community, employers, churches, even, like, say, for example, I've had we're working at Columbia, like, there's this push towards, like, we're finding that people are ending their lives in hotels. And so they're like checking into a hotel and ending their life by suicide in a hotel room. Of course, when you end your life by suicide, it's a messy situation, right? And so they're not wanting to do that in their homes. or in their vehicles. And, they're sometimes very thoughtful, believe it or not, the way they're doing this. So we're like, okay, are hotel workers part of the equation? Do I need to work better with hotel front desk workers so that when people check in, they can ask them, how are you? What brings you to Charlotte? Um, and maybe they can like just have a conversation, because sometimes it's one small act of kindness that can save a life. Sometimes it's just like one outreach from someone that cares about them when they felt invisible for so long. So now it's like, let's train what we call gatekeepers. That means like everybody. Marine Corps, we had when we were trying to unpack this issue, one of the things we identified is that the Marines stopped going to the gym. They love their fitness, right? And suddenly that was like the red flag. Like, okay, I used to see this guy every day after work. He was always here by 4:45, or she was here. Now they're not here. That's your red flag. So then it was like, all right, so what do we do? Do we train the gym people? Do we tell fellow Marines like fitness is important, and when it's no longer, that's your red flag. So like the gyms became an important part of our puzzle. So you start to see how public health is, it sort of brings everybody to the table. Um, so questions so far, how are we doing on the content? I want to tell you one more thing about the field. It's a little
No,
more.
we're fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is this term in the field called postvention, right? And this basically means when you've been impacted by suicide, you're now at risk. First of all, I want to tell you, it follows down gender lines and families. So as a clinician, it's not uncommon. You'll bring somebody in, you'll ask them about suicide risk, and you'll say, has anybody in your family ever died by suicide? And they will say, my grandfather and my uncle, and my dad has made an attempt that I'm aware of. I have a close colleague at the VA. She wrote a book. In her book, she talks about Cheryl Mason. She actually used to be on the board for the Independence Fund. But she talks about the fact that her brother and her dad, from the main stage, she'll give this talk, but they both died by suicide. It's like it becomes an okay solution. Like, for example, in the Franklin family, when things get tough, we can do this, which is not okay, right? So it can run down families. Equally so, think about a military unit and a group of veterans like that are part of the 180th or the 208th Bravo Company. Like they're a family too, right? Is it an okay solution in our family when things get tough, right? Within a veteran unit? And in communities, that's when you start to see terms like cluster or contagion. You'll hear the word suicide contagion. You'll see a high school that had 7 suicides within a year. So we do worry about this. And in the field, this has been studied. And again, when I first came into the field, we had a data point. It's so crazy the things that you remember from your career. Think about your own careers. But early on, I remember we had a data point that said when somebody dies by suicide, 7 people are impacted. And they're now at risk. Mom, dad, brother, sister, next door neighbor, good friend. Like it was like whoever their 7 people were. Well, fast forward all these years, we now have social media. We now have increased social networks, and we've studied the issue out further, and we believe, based on the research, that for every single death by suicide, 135 people are now at risk. So when people ask me the question, why are veterans dying by suicide at a rate higher than their non-veteran counterparts? Well, they're part of a family, and a lot of them have died by suicide related to the level of trauma. And because a lot have died, a lot are at risk. That's a simple answer, but if one dies by suicide and 135 are impacted, if you do the math based on the number that died in 2002, you'll see that half the nation is now at risk. Like just has been touched by it and have been exposed to it. There is a researcher that uses the word exposed to describe it because it basically, when you've been exposed to cigarette smoke in the day, like if your grandparents or somebody smoked cigarettes, you're like in a car with them, you breathe it in, and like you've not, like there's no getting rid of it, right? Like I breathe in cigarette smoke. It's like part of who I am now. Like um, they've been exposed to it. It's like being exposed to like a chemical or cigarettes or something. It's the same thing for suicide risk. Like there's no changing it. There's no not knowing that your fellow colleague, your fellow vet died by suicide. So you've been exposed. So that's part of the struggle. And what we're trying to do with the Columbia protocol that I'm about to show you is create a common language so people are comfortable talking about it. They know how to ask the right questions. They're not. Either way, I will tell you, having trained like just thousands of graduates, students coming into the field of mental health, or lay folks that are not in the field of mental health but are in other important fields, either way, it's a difficult conversation. It's not easy. Mental health clinicians alone are nervous doing it. Like it's not like it comes like the back of their hand. Like I've trained them and I've had them stay after and say like, I'm afraid to do this. I'm afraid for the answer and I'm afraid will I do and say the right thing. And I've had them do it and their client has said yes and I've had them right away call and said, I did it. My client said yes and I'm, either way, I just don't want you to think like this is like while the scale I believe is simple, the act of doing it does take courage and carefulness. So
Dr.
these are
Franklin,
yes.
uh, you may be getting into this, so if you are, just let me know. But you had mentioned that spirituality is an important factor
Yes.
in suicide prevention. Are you,
Yes.
can you go into a little more detail in regard to that?
Yes. I'll tell you what the research says. And I'm glad you asked me because I shouldn't have just said it so flippantly too and quickly. Um, So in the field, one of the biggest protective factors that we've identified, I talked to you about social support, a sister sort of protective factor to that is spirituality, and we've struggled with defining that. So in the day, like there's this thinking that if people go to church, they belong to a church and they go to church, that's a protective factor against suicide risk. And the thinking about it is, I belong to a group. I'm in this church, and this matters to me. I like this role, and I belong with this group, and they're an accepting group when I go there, they're looking for me. I have a girlfriend that is very proud of her local church here in Stafford. And she says, when I go, I sit in the same seat every week because I do the children's music and I need to sit in that seat so I can get up there quickly and do what I do. Right. So this is so important to her. And no one should sit in her seat and people will know if she's not in that seat. Like that is just like so important to her, right? And to me, I'm like, Denise, that sounds like suicide prevention. Like when you say that, because that's what we try to teach in the field. So, like, they belong to a group, they have a role in the group, they feel a sense of purpose, they feel a sense of belongingness. All of this matters to them. And then from there, um, they get involved in other things like where they can pay it forward and that bring them meaning and purpose. The flip side of that is we've had a group of researchers that have said, it's not church and membership in church alone. It's actually belief in a higher power bigger than themselves. So for our vets, like I used to hear them talk about like with the Marine Corps, that it was like belief in the commandant. Like that was their higher power. Like they believed in the core. Well, that's also a risk factor when they're no longer, once Marine, always Marine. But when they're no longer wearing the uniform, that could also be a risk factor. But the notion of spirituality being like nature, like what I don't want is for people that don't go to church to think that they alone are at risk of suicide. But I do want people to know that like if they get a part of a group, like that could be a life-saving measure. So it's complicated, right? Yeah. Um,
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay, so these are the questions. So Dr. Posner, my colleague at Columbia, validated this scale, and it basically starts with this very simple question. You ask the first two. Depending on how they answer the first two, depends on whether or not you go to the others. But the first one is, have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? And so you're just outright going to ask that question. We implemented this scale across all the emergency rooms at the VA because veterans were showing up in the ER in the days leading up to their death by suicide with back pain and headaches, and it was like a missed opportunity. So, of course, I got all manner of pushback at the time because the ER docs are screening for a lot of things, and they were like, oh, another screener. But I'm like, this is an important one. If they say yes to that, you'll ask them, have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself? And depending on how they answer that question, if they say no, then you're done the screener. And we provided, and I talked to Nish, we're going to send this out on email throughout the listserv that she has as well. I'm going to write some language on this, but we're going to give the scale and explain this to folks that weren't able to dial in because it's just those two simple questions. And then if they say yes, though, you're going to go on to the next question, which is, have you been thinking about how you might do this? Part of this question is we're trying to understand how detailed is their plan. So this is the difference between, for example, a Marine who says yes to both questions and then says, I'm thinking that I will do it with a firearm. And then they say, but I don't have one. And I'm not sure how I would get one when I'm not on duty. I would never do it on duty. So, okay, you're starting to understand a little bit more versus like a Marine that says, look, at Quantico, I go to the train tracks every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. and I watch that train go by and I think about putting myself in front of the train. Like their plan is very detailed and they started to act on it. So we're trying to understand, do they have a plan and how close is the plan to being something they would act about? So we ask the question, then we get a little deeper and we ask the question, have you had these thoughts and had some intention on acting of them? Um, Again, we're trying to know like what is their plan? How detailed is their plan? Have you started to work out or worked out the details to carry out this plan? This is when I will hear from people that have said, yes, I'm thinking of dying by suicide. I've researched it. I know that it's this type of medication that will do it. And I've been saving up on these type of medications to make it happen. So you're really trying to get after the level of details. And then you're asking, have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? And so this is where you're really trying to get after whether or not they're starting to get ready to, end their life by suicide. But it's collectively what Dr. Posner has done with the scale is validate the science behind every single question. Every word that's in the scale matters. Like this is not something that you could like ask question 6 and then go to question 2. Like you have to follow it in the order. Each word matters. And you're really trying to understand whether they're at low risk, moderate risk, or high risk, because depending where they fall on the risk, and you see how it's just like yellow, orange, red, depending on how they fall on the screener will depend on like what you do about it. And so at the very end, you're asking, how many times in your life has this happened? Because you're trying to understand the recency. When we see on the fatality review of individuals that have died by suicide, we do see that they have had an attempt in their past. So if you know someone that has had an attempt in their past, know that they could be at increased risk of suicide because they've tried before and there's, we've made a save, like we've been able to get in there and get them sort of off the bridge, or maybe they took medication and we arrive at the home and we're able to get them to the hospital and get their stomach pumped and get them to a safe place. So we do want to know how many times and how recent was it. I had this happen in my own life recently where somebody said to me, look, I've been so depressed. I'm thinking of ending my life. I've thought of ending my life by suicide. And my first question, this was a relative. I was like, recently? Because I was about to like get going on the Columbia scale. Like, what do you mean you're telling me this? I thought I was teaching this person some signs of depression, like just kind of a little small teachable moment. And it was like, she was like, no, I know about depression. Look, I've been so depressed. And recent. So you really do want to know, is this like far past or not? So right now, where we're at in the field is that anyone can ask these questions. Anybody. We think it goes over well with veterans when peers ask them, like when one of their own does it. And so I want to make sure you know that like also how you ask it matters. I have had folks that will say, someone said to me once, you're not thinking of ending it all, are you? Like that's like what not to do. Like you're not thinking of dying by suicide, are you? Like it sounds super judgy. So like how you do it also matters. You want to make sure that you're clear, you have positive body language, that you're non-judgmental, that you're looking right at them, and you can also be your authentic self. Like I always tell people, you can say like, look, I have to ask you this because I'm worried about you. Or you can even say, we had a training at the church last year and it reminds me of something you're going through. So I have to ask you, like, just be yourself, but definitely, ask it. We have an app as well that I can sort of show you. We can put it in our points that we're going to push out niche to the community, but because people might not always have the tool handy and it's hard. Even I've used it so many times, I still look at it when I use it. I'll still pull up the app because I want to make sure I don't mess up the order or anything. So you definitely want to be attentive, responsive, steady voice, listen carefully. We tell veterans, because veterans are also good storytellers, right? So they always have a story for something. And we want to make sure that they know this is not the time to say, like, oh, look, one of my troops had this problem and one of my troops did this and said this and they saved their life this way. And like, definitely not the time for any like stories like that. And you sort of reflect back to them what you're hearing. If they are at imminent risk, which if we go back to the scale, let me show you. If they say yes to things in the red and they are at high risk, that would mean that they're at high risk. They're saying yes, they say they have thoughts, they say they've started to work out the plan. It sounds detailed, it's been within the past 3 months, and they're at high risk. At that point, you want to stay with them. People ask the question, what do I do when they say when they say yes? And I will tell you, what's easiest is almost the high risk because you have to stay with them, you know what to do. And the low risk is easiest. The middle is the harder part. when they're to me, they're at moderate risk, you almost just want to err on the side of safety and overdo it. But that can also sort of be problematic because someone's like, look, I didn't say I'm gonna, totally end my life and you're taking me to the ER. And that can agitate them, right? So I feel like the middle is hard, but the high end, you stay with them, you keep them safe. And then this is when you're starting to communicate with them about their reasons for living. And if they're a parent, children's always one. But you will also hear people talk about their pets. You'll hear them talk about, like, all right, well, there's some minuscule task that has to happen tomorrow, and they're the only one that can do it. I'm the only one with the key to the church playroom, and I have to open the playroom in the morning. Like they'll say, so I was like, okay, well, then you're pulling on that lever, right? So you're looking for reasons for living, and then you're staying with them to make like a warm handoff to a professional. Because while we are trying to teach people how to use the Columbia and how to screen for suicide risk, we know they're not therapists. We don't want them to feel like now they're stuck in this role where they're like having to get into this like super in-depth intervention. And if they're not at risk, they could still be struggling. And that could be me and you and anybody on any given day. So if they're not at risk, you want to stay, you want to talk to them, you want to assess their social support. You're always trying to build up social support so that you're not in it alone. Like, who else is in their circle? Who else can they call? Do they have a friend? Do they have a colleague? When was the last time they spoke to them? Are they on good terms with them? Who else can we connect them to? And that includes the church, right? Like, can we connect them into a group at the church? Is there a women's group? Is there a, some special group that they can shine and be a part of? We have, like I said, I told you about the app. All right. So yeah, this is Kelly loves to give out her email address. Of course, mine is Keita.Franklin with the same ending, NYSPI, Columbia.edu, but she has a general mailbox that we get all the questions in. You're always allowed to reach her. If you're part of a group and you want another training, I was telling Nish, you guys might know of the bank USAA. USAA gave a grant to the Columbia, the university, and this project to train groups. So that's how it's a small grant, but we're able to go out and provide this training, provide clipboards and like copies of cards, which we can send to your church and you can keep them in the lobby or whatever. And part of it is because USAA has this commitment as part of their push. They've raised private sector dollars. So it's a group called Face the Fight, and they are trying to do innovative suicide prevention activities for veterans, and that's how the Columbia got one of the grants, and that's how we're doing this work. But truth be told, it was going on well before the grant, and it will continue to go on after the grant. But it's always nice that we can do a little more because of the grant. So, what questions do folks have about the scale? Let me stop sharing so I can see everyone too. Okay, there we go. Or any questions in general about the field of mental health or military and veteran issues at all? Totally open. Would folks feel comfortable using it if they had to?
Yeah, Dr. Franklin, this is Lyle. I was, probably 5 or so years ago. I was in Massachusetts, your home state, and
Yes.
as you know, in Mass, each town is required to have a veteran service officer, and I
Yes.
have a military background, so I had the job for a couple of years, and one fine afternoon, a couple of people came running into my office and said, "There's a guy across the street, a military veteran. He says he's going to commit suicide." So, well,
Mm.
I didn't know what to do. So I said, "Can you bring him over here?" I said, "Yeah." So they did, and he sat down, and I asked him to leave and close the door. And I figured if I could keep him talking,
Yes.
he couldn't kill himself. And I didn't know what to say, but
Yeah.
I wound up asking him about his military duty, and he and I about the same age, so we talked about Vietnam, and I
Nice.
kind of got all fired up about telling war stories and wound up, not killing himself. But I totally shocked, and I don't know what I said and what I didn't. I just wanted to keep him talking long enough to, wear himself out. So,
Well, I appreciate your comment though, because sometimes it is, I didn't bring it up in the talk, but it's sometimes like just being present with people, right? And having them feel heard and like they matter. And that's probably what you did that day, whether you knew it or not, whether you had any formal training or not, you were yourself and you made them feel better about themselves for a short period of time. And then the idea is we get them into the care they need if needed. And because it's impulsive, you got him through that impulsive period. Yeah. Thank you for that example.
I guess I'm better off with luck than skill, but as I said, I figured if I could keep him talking, he wasn't going to pull a trigger on himself. So
Yes. Yes. Somebody else was about to say something too.
Dr. Franklin, I'm Erin Smith, so I'm the local missions minister here at Weddington, but I just want to say
Oh.
thank you for taking this time and sharing this with us. Looking kind of at this whole group that's on the call right now, we have not only our military committee group who has the most interaction with our veterans and our veteran community, but we also have children and youth in our front office, and
Good.
and we get a lot of people who walk through the door looking for financial assistance who are in that trauma. There's some kind of trauma, there's some kind of crisis
Yeah.
that they're in the middle of. So I just feel like this is so applicable to so many different areas that we touch. So even just the simple things like you were saying, like, asking about sleep, like having raised two teenage daughters, like that's just an easy question, right? Like,
Yes.
hey, how are you sleeping? How are things at home? How are you? And what you just said about when you said the lack of social support was the number one, I wrote right beside it, be present. And I think you
Yes.
just said it. So I feel
Yeah.
like that's like a constant thing that we hear, especially within the church body, is that, we get so busy wrapped up in our plans and the program and whatever's happening, but really, like you said, paying attention to who's sitting in the pew beside you, who's not showing up to youth group, who's not been, attending for a while, like who are we missing, and then kind of what's going on. How can we be present with them? How can we walk with them? How can we listen? So I
Yes.
just want to say thank you. I think it's super impactful for a faith community to learn this and to be present with this topic.
Yes, I appreciate you for bringing that up. And I spoke to Nish yesterday about like we want to do more. Like this is like an untapped area to get involved in because if you think about it, it's like a faith-based community, like you said, that has financial assistance. Sometimes they do food, like in Stafford County, where we send people for food assistance is this local church. Like they have a food bank there. So there's food security, there's financial security, there's social support, there's getting involved. There's just so many things that hit on suicide. So I think we in the field have not tapped into this community enough
Yeah.
to bring them into the fold for our, so they know everything they're doing already is a suicide prevention tactic.
Yeah, and I think the research you guys have done with veterans, just like you said, you can pinch it down to everybody across the board, starting even with our youngest kids. And we know the numbers are decreasing. Like we see it in our own school systems, we see it, in our own communities. So not only just the veteran community, but just across the board.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You reminded me as well to tell you, when I was at the Pentagon, we had this initiative where we were also trying to teach firearm sellers to also just ask, how are you? Like just to have a little more small talk rather than to just like, and of course, like we're not trying to get in the way of a sale, but like, is somebody not well and they're buying a firearm? Because one of the things we also found in the data was that while our veterans and service members were ending their life by suicide 70% of the time with a firearm, they were also buying the firearm in the days leading up to their death. So these are not your like long-standing safe firearm owners who use their firearms for hunting and go to the shooting range and have fun. They actually went and bought one as part of their plan. So it was like, we started trying to teach the firearm owners, the firearm sellers that question. And now we go, the Independence Fund is actually part of that. They'll go to like this it's called SHOT Show, where we like bring all these, who know, right? Like all these trade associations bring like thousands of people to the city, to a single city, and they have these conventions on firearms. But we really go there too, and we teach them, like, check in with your people as you're making the sale.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Dr. Franklin, good afternoon. My name is Mark Woodrum. I'm Robin's husband. I've been paying attention in the background.
Excellent.
Obviously, you mentioned several times about the impulse for this to take place. And once we become involved and hopefully break that impulse, what kind of recommendations would you have about the follow-up? Obviously, that's not just a one thing and we just ignore it. But we want to have follow-up to try to help prevent that impulse from coming back,
Yes.
6 weeks, 6 months down the road. What would you recommend are tactics that we can employ or that we can at least have in a background that we can do in order to help prevent that impulse from coming back?
Yes, such a good question. Because what we want to do is get people engaged in like what we'll say is a life worth living, which is specific and unique to them. And so we really want to get them involved in definitely social support, but then like like what would a life worth living be to them? Like to me, I absolutely love being on the water. I like to quilt. So when I can like be with other people and quilt, and I like a big challenge. Like I like to be challenged at work. Like I can't, I don't like to be bored. So like you have to kind of get to know people to understand what would a life worth living be for them. And so that they're not just there, but they're really like engaged in life. Is it sports? Is it, and because we'll see this with our vets, they'll get like a physical injury and now they can't do their thing, which was like water skiing or some extreme sport, right? And so now what can we substitute in that? Can they like teach others how to surf? Like I was with Marine Corps, so like I remember all these Marines at Camp Lejeune that would be into surfing, and then they would have these injuries, these TBIs and stuff, and they couldn't surf anymore. Well, couldn't they teach surfing? Can they like we still have to like find out like a life worth living. So what does that look like? And that's why it's so hard because you have to really get to know people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Thank you all so much for letting me visit with you today about this topic and being willing to chat about suicide. Not a lot of people just love dialing into a call on suicide risk. So I really do appreciate you guys for that. Next time we'll do one on, alcohol and drugs. No, I'm kidding.
Doc,
Dr.
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 Franklin
Franklin,
is,
go ahead,
I'm sorry,
Ron.
go ahead. Oh, are veterans as a group the most at risk for suicide? And within that, the subset of combat veterans, are they more at risk than non-combat veterans?
Yes, so veterans are more at risk than their civilian counterparts, and they will like match them. Like, okay, in the sample, if I have a bunch of 18 to 24-year-olds, they'll like match it with 18 to 24-year-olds that have not served. And veterans are at increased risk. And it's hard to I shared with you about deployment. Combat exposure does put people at increased risk. Not just like, for example, how do I say my husband went to Qatar? He was in Qatar in 2002, right when the war kicked off. He did not fire his weapon while he was there. He felt a little unsafe at times, but not like, an infantryman in the army that was on the front lines and carried his weapon every day and kicked in doors and did all sorts of things like that. Like that deployment was not, he did not experience combat exposure on that deployment per se through his lens. So you do have to like unpack the combat exposure variable, which is why there's like a scale. Surprisingly, when I read the scale, it's part of my own research, some of the questions on it are like, did you aim your weapon at an enemy? Did you aim your weapon at a child? Because these veterans end up in they call it like a moral conflict. And well, the term is moral injury if you're interested. Like Google moral injury, and it's basically like I'm here with something that just does not make sense with my morals and values. Like I'm trying to protect the nation. I'm downrange with my weapon at a child. Like we would never do that. Or would we? This child is carrying, has an IED and has just, one in their group has just, an IED just went off from their group and killed two of our own. Like it's just complicated. But you start to see also, you can pull up this measure. It's called the Combat Exposure Scale, or for short, they call it like CES. So it is particular. Also, our veterans, they join the military to get a sense of purpose. So they're really looking for that. And then some of them are joined to like leave abusive home situations. So, having done mental health in clinics for years, you'll do a screener and they'll talk about situations that you would not imagine, right? They've joined the military and they have prior sexual abuse. You'll ask them questions about that and you will be surprised at the ages that they will share that. It's truly like just disheartening like none other.
Mm.
And they'll share what I, as a social worker, have to tell them is physical abuse, and they think it was, just rough parenting. And when they describe it, no, or they'll describe extreme situations of neglect where they didn't have their basic needs met. And they'll say, after you get to know them in therapy, you'll say, no, know that by today's standards would have been neglect. Like not knowing when your next meal came and not having access to food during the summers because school was out, that's neglect. And so then they join the military. So we end up believing that these people that join the military have these pre-existing risk factors. They come to us with them, is sort of what we think from a research standpoint. Also, like I worked at the Pentagon under General Dunford, who was then our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I'm hearing his voice was always like, Keita, these are the very people that we want, who are willing to take risks and do these courageous things that we need them to do. Like we want to form them into the Marines that they are, and we want them to do these things. So This is why the issues are always so complicated and can't give one easy answer.
Well, that's one of the reasons that you hit on that I like Operation Resilience so much, is because
Yes.
you're taking this group of people who have been in combat and you're pulling them back together to be able to say, how are you dealing with life now? And being able to share and root
Yes.
down, any of the concerns that they have. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I was telling Nish yesterday, the Independence Fund reunites these combat units. It's always amazing to me. They maybe won't see each other in 10 or 15 years and they'll bring them all back. They've been doing them time and time again recently in Charlotte because Charlotte's just like such a good city that for hosting them for like they do some fun and friendship things. Like they go to a checkers game and they have social meals together and they go to whitewater rafting. I run the psych groups for them, the psychoeducational groups. But we unpack their deployment. We talk about what went up to the lead up of the deployment. We unpack the actual deployment and then the post deployment. And there could be it's a little risky. Like for me as a worker, like we're used to doing these type of groups with like 8 to 10 and they'll bring together like 70 men in a room in a hotel in Charlotte. And as soon as we'll ask the question, like, tell me about the lead up to the deployment, what year is it? What was going on? And they start to describe like the historical facts about Iraq and Afghanistan. And they'll start to describe this recent one we just had said, we trained up to go to Iraq. At the last minute, the Army shifted us to Afghanistan. We trained up for urban and we trained up for this type of language. And then we needed this language and we didn't have it. We trained up expecting to see this, and then with only 33 months notice, we saw this. It was very different. But as they start to move from the historical facts, they'll move to the emotional. And before you know it, there's like not a dry eye in the room, and they're all just, talking about the deployment and what went on. And the most recent one that we hosted, they lost 30 veterans to wartime injuries related to the deployment, and the same number to suicide after they left active duty. And so they're the big thing is like, let's not lose any more of our own. So like we get them together, we do a duty roster, they get all their phone numbers. We want them to stay in contact with each other now. And literally they will say that it was life-saving. By Sunday morning, they stay together from Thursday night to Sunday morning doing these activities. And we just wear them out too. Like they just stay like right on the go.
But that's where the church could be this safety net, really, for these people who are coming out of the military.
Yes.
They've had traumatic experiences for
So
whatever
true.
reasons, and now they're in this very different world, that's completely commercial. And what kind of support do you have there? So
Yes.
I think that's a perfect place for the church to step in.
Yeah, a couple
Yes.
of us attended that Thursday night
Oh,
dinner
did
launch.
you?
And
Okay.
it was really cool to see the guys just like the
Yes.
hugs and just like their excitement in
Yes.
seeing one another again. And they
Yes.
got the bus, we did the heroes walk, like the whole thing. It just was
Oh,
a really neat
good. I'm glad you guys are.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's
there's
really
little parts of it that we can help and jump in and be a part of. So yeah.
it's hard to put words on it. It even outside of operas when I worked in the Pentagon, I'm largely doing policy and advocacy at the sort of the highest levels of government. But I would see two service members walk down the hall beside one another that hadn't seen one another in a long time. And I like to stop because they're just fully engaged in a great big hug and they're so happy to see each other. And I just want to see it.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna stand here and watch this.
It's a fantastic program that Independence
Yeah.
Fund runs. Yeah, it's so meaningful.
Hopefully if you guys come again, I'll get to meet you because I always try to go to those. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Actor Franklin, I'm a Vietnam vet. I got home in 1970, and I don't remember suicide being a big issue back in those days. I remember a lot of excess drinking and drugs, but
Oh, yes.
not suicide. Is the incidence of suicide a fairly recent phenomenon?
Yeah, we're wondering that in the field, and I get that question a lot. Like, was it happening and it was so taboo that families weren't elevating it? Like, I have met with medical examiners and coroners that say, like, gosh, in my town, we would never put suicide on a death certificate because what would that mean for the Franklins, like in rural Maine or something, right? Like, what would that mean? So, like, they're in fact not putting the accurate data, which like literally does us no justice because that's how we pull down dollars from the Congress and get it to the field based on how prevalent the problem is. So, like, would you not put that someone died by cancer and then like we couldn't get dollars to solve cancer research? Like, we wouldn't do that. But these medical examiners, they do that. Like, they won't put it accurate. So I don't know if we're talking about it more and people are more likely to like mark the death certificates accurate, or if in fact it is happening more. Like it's an ongoing debate in the field. You'll see both camps of people, of the researchers that believe this is a new phenomenon, and then you'll oh no, this was a secret phenomenon. So I'm not sure.
Well, I know we've gone past an hour here. Any remaining questions for Dr. Franklin?
Hopefully I can meet you guys in person if you're at TIFF or something, or when next time I'm down in Charlotte.
Well, thank you so much. This is a great conversation. I think we're
Thank
all
you.
taking away a lot of good lessons. So we appreciate your time and just sharing all of this experience and intellect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate getting to do it with you guys today. Like I said, this is awesome. And thank you for all the work that you're doing with veterans and stuff and folks down there. So it really means a lot to the community.